This is Far From Home. I'm Scott Gurian. Several years ago, I found myself in the Rabuni refugee camp in the middle of the Sahara Desert in the remote southwest corner of Algeria. How I ended up there is a long story that I'll save for a future episode, but for the purposes of today's show, here's what you need to know. Rabuni and its 4 nearby sister refugee camps are home to about 175,000 people who've been displaced from their native territory of Western Sahara ever since Morocco invaded back in 1975. Half a century later, it's become one of the longest-lasting refugee camps in the world, and although the original tents have now been replaced with more permanent houses, the situation for most people remains pretty dire. According to the United Nations, more than 80% of the indigenous Sahrawi inhabitants rely on humanitarian food assistance, and over 10% of the young children experience acute malnutrition. So the community's survival depends in large part upon charity from international donors, which is funneled through the United Nations World Food Program. During my visit, I had an opportunity to get a first-hand look at all of this when I toured a food distribution warehouse operated by the Sahrawi Red Crescent. My guide and interpreter, Fatima, showed me around. What is this whole space that we're in here? Can you describe where we are here?
This is the place that they keep the food that the organization gives to the Sahrawi people. This is for the families. They give it to them every month.
So they get a certain ration of...
Yes, and they came from the ports of Algeria.
Okay.
And then from Algeria to Tindouf, from Tindouf to here.
Okay.
So it's a whole process.
Okay.
And you can see.
Oh yeah, there's a truck leaving right here.
Right here. Let's go there and you can see.
So we're in a big warehouse here, stacked with pallets and pallets of big bags of, I guess, grain. They say World Food Program on them. A bunch of these say rice. It says country of origin, Pakistan. 50 kilograms each bag weighs. So that side says rice, and then there's a bunch of pallets with, looks like shrink-wrapped gallons of soy oil fortified with vitamins A and D, funded by the European Union humanitarian aid. You see more bags here of skimmed milk powder from Switzerland. What does each family get each month, do you know?
I will ask them. Assalamu alaikum, Bashir.
We found this guy named Bashir, who was the director of the food distribution center.
Everybody gets 1 liter of oil.
Each person gets 1 liter of soy oil each month.
Yes.
Okay.
lentejas, ¿sabes cómo se dice en inglés?
Lentils?
Lentils.
و8 كيلو من farina, 8 kilos.
And 8 kilos of harina.
Like a grain, like wheat flour?
Flour, yes, flour.
Yeah. 8 kilo of flour.
Okay.
و2 من المعروف الريس. Rice.
And 2 kilos of
2 kilos of rice per person per month. Okay.
Yeah, و2 من الشعير.
Barley.
Yes.
Barley, 2 kilos of barley. Okay. Bashir said there were also some other basic items that were included, like chickpeas and sugar, but meat's too expensive. So if residents want that, they have to find it on their own. Overall, he said each person gets a total of 60 to 70 kilograms, or about 130 to 150 pounds of food rations each month to help cover their most basic dietary needs. Walking through this warehouse stocked with Pakistani rice, Swiss milk, and Russian barley, you could easily be forgiven for not recognizing the enormous role of another country that was looming large in the background and whose generous support was helping fuel this entire operation. That country was the United States of America. Over the past few years, the U.S. has contributed $1.5 million a year to the World Food Program's response efforts in the Sahrawi refugee camps, and it also gave an additional $8 million annually for the United Nations Refugee Agency's work in the region. But recently, all that began to change. If you've been following the news over the past few months, you've no doubt heard about President Trump taking a sort of slash-and-burn approach to much of the U.S. government. And among the many taxpayer-funded programs he's taken a hatchet to has been American foreign assistance distributed through the Agency for International Development, or USAID. That's billions of dollars that helped with things like Ebola prevention in West Africa, malaria testing in Myanmar, famine relief in war-torn Sudan, and, yes, food deliveries to the refugees from Western Sahara. It started on Trump's very first day in office when he issued an executive order immediately halting all foreign aid programs pending a 90-day review. And in the weeks that followed, his administration placed thousands of aid workers around the world on leave. With the help of Elon Musk, who Trump appointed to run the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, USAID was quickly dismantled, and it soon became clear that most of this supposed temporary suspension of foreign assistance would likely become permanent. Which brings me back to the Rabuni refugee camp. I reached out the other day to the president of the Sahrawi Red Crescent, which runs that food distribution warehouse I visited, because I wanted to see how it might be affected. And here's what he told me. So far this year, the U.S. has given just half of what it would normally give for food assistance to the camps, and with USAID shuttered, it appears unlikely that the rest of the money will ever arrive. Other American donations to aid the Sahrawi people through the UN Refugee Agency have also seen a 20% budget cut so far, and given that the U.S. provides a substantial percentage of the camp's international aid funding, it seems doubtful that other donor nations will be able to step in to make up the difference. As the head of the Red Crescent told me, there is unprecedented uncertainty and suspense. In the midst of all these budget cuts, Elon Musk posted something on X a few weeks ago that caught my attention. In response to criticism, he tweeted that no one has died as a result of what he called a brief pause to do a sanity check on foreign aid funding. But as time has passed, more and more evidence has emerged that that assurance simply isn't true. The British newspaper The Telegraph reported in early February that a number of people in Thai refugee camps passed away after USAID-funded hospitals were forced to close and medical workers abruptly left the area, cutting off patients' oxygen supplies. More recently, New York Times reporter Nicholas Kristof visited South Sudan, where he heard stories of children who died after losing access to their American-funded HIV medications, which had only cost about 12 cents a day. The World Health Organization says that the Trump administration's decision to cut foreign aid means 8 countries could completely exhaust their supplies of life-saving HIV medications in the coming months. And internal memos from USAID itself estimate that dismantling the agency could cause up to 166,000 worldwide deaths each year from malaria, not to mention 1 million children who will suffer from severe malnutrition and 200,000 who will be paralyzed with polio. If you're like me, when you read stories in the news about wonky political topics like budget cuts, it's really easy to tune things out. I mean, when the only perspectives you hear are from politicians in Washington talking about this policy or that, it's hard to imagine how these sorts of decisions will affect actual people's lives in concrete terms. And it's also hard to have compassion or empathy. So, in an effort to change that in some small way, I'm going to share with you on today's program some conversations I've had over the past few weeks with people around the world who are feeling some of the direct impacts. And there's probably no single place that's felt the impacts of these cuts greater than the East African country of Sudan, which is in the midst of a civil war. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, the conflict is plunging the country into the worst famine the world has seen in at least 40 years. To get some perspective, I rang up Hajuj Kuka from Emergency Response Rooms, a humanitarian relief organization in Sudan's Khartoum state, and I asked him to describe what's going on.
We've been at war for over 21 months. The war started in April 2023. It started between the army and then paramilitary group that was part of the army called the Rapid Response Force, the RSF. And after they had together instituted a coup on the transitional government. There was a moment where they were supposed to give in power to the civilians, and instead of doing that, they tried to take over the country and set up their own government, but there was a lot of protest against them, so they couldn't. And after a very long time of protest, over a year, they started fighting each other, and this war broke out, which is a very different war than anything we experienced before, because it was not based on any ideology, it wasn't based in any deep differences. They were like friends who did the coup together that then fought, and we thought it will end quickly. The army stated that they will take over and win this paramilitary group within a few days, but it's been 21 months. The army is right now in the advances, but the RSF, this rebel paramilitary militia, controls over 40% of the country.
So you're in the midst of this civil war. What is it like for the average person there now?
It's horrible. It's beyond horrible. It's the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world. Half the population, so about 25 million people, need humanitarian aid. There's 15 million that got displaced. From the 18 states of Sudan, there's war going on in 10 of them. Education has stopped in the whole country. So there's like 19 million kids who can't go to school. Our universities are stopped. Work is stopped. People haven't gotten paid for 2 years. And then there's killings. Almost 150,000 is the low count of the civilians killed. The number of youth that got killed in this war is just uncounted. It's like thousands of people got killed.
I'm just trying to get a sense of like daily life for people there now. It's clearly not life as normal.
Right now, people are sitting in the verge where there's no electricity. There has been no electricity for a year and a half. There's no running water, and there's no security whatsoever right now. The militias themselves, the RSF, are looting. At the same time, this army is coming in. So right now, everybody's just trying to find enough food to be like, would they be able to survive for a week if this siege lasts for a week? Beyond a week, there's a body called IPC. This is the body that declares famines in the world. So Sudan has already been declared pockets of famine, and these are increasing. And right now, if we have a siege for a month, then Khartoum city, which is the capital city, which is supposed to be the richest city in Sudan before the war, is going to have a famine. And this is for sure. The only way out was if we had enough resources to buy enough stuff, enough stock and whatnot, but we actually don't. So the way emergency response rooms work, it works on the principle of mutual aid. So the idea of mutual aid is every neighborhood organizes and figures out what they want. And then from the state level, we try to get as much money as we can, and then we give it to each neighborhood. Each neighborhood decides what to do with it. So that's how we work. And we started in Khartoum, and then we expanded to Darfur, and then Kordofan and Kassala, and just like as the war is expanding, the emergency response rooms, this mutual aid grassroots system is expanding. We collaborated and partnershiped with UNICEF and a lot of the big organizations. They get medicine or they get food, and then we distribute it. So basically, we managed this mutual aid group to do all of that.
So it seems like the biggest needs right now are protecting people, providing evacuation if you're able to, but also, I guess, feeding people seems like the biggest need that you're trying to provide with your funding. Is that right?
This moment in the siege, it is. This is what we need most. We need to keep people alive. We just need to survive.
A lot of these areas, as you're describing, are kind of on the brink of starvation, and it sounds like the services you're providing are pretty vital. And I've got to say, all this sounds like it might take a lot of money and a lot of resources. So, up until this point, how have you paid for it?
In the beginning of the war, we started by using our own resources. So people got stuff from their neighborhoods and cooked together. And then a lot of the middle class left. The diaspora started sending money, but after a while that became a lot. And then we started these partnerships with international NGOs. And one of the biggest supporters from the beginning was USAID. They really believed that what we did was very efficient cost-wise, but also because the number of people, like we have over 10,000 coordinating volunteers throughout Sudan. And the 10,000 is mainly young people and it's mainly women. So it's like the group that is normally marginalized by the war. So USAID really felt that, okay, this group of people, yes, they will save lives now, but also they would be very beneficial in returning Sudan, hopefully to a democracy or at least a place where civilians matter. So there was a lot of support and excitement about the emergency response rooms. We actually got nominated twice for the Nobel Peace Prize, last year and this year. And USAID was one of the biggest funders, especially when it came to protection. We really depended on USAID. USAID through some international NGOs, they don't give us the money directly, it comes through international NGOs. But through some international NGOs, up to now, whenever we really needed it, they were really there to actually evacuate people, protect them in different ways and whatnot. And that's one of the things right now, this moment, when we went to our partners thinking that, hey, we have to evacuate all these people and everything, we just got an email saying there's nothing.
It was just kind of a sudden thing, no warning at all?
Super sudden, beyond sudden. Like, it was shocking. Yesterday, I was expecting some money to come from one of our funders, and we were supposed to receive it. And we already had all these meetings and decided that this money is going to go to this emergency response room, and this will go to this food, and this will go to evacuation. And when we were supposed to have this talk with them where they're supposed to send us the money, they just sent us an email saying that there was a freeze. They hope it's still going to come, but there's a freeze right now. So we were just suddenly had to replan everything, and we have to find other ways to fundraise and whatnot. And it's just the wrong timing. When you have a siege and you have this army coming at you, every day counts. Every day people are running. We have a population about 500,000 people who are under the siege, and either the army takes over really quick and this war ends really quickly, which is not expected, or we're going to see a lot of people dying.
What have the past few days been like for you and your colleagues, just coming to the realization that you don't have this money, it doesn't seem like it's coming, and you got to scramble to kind of figure out what to do?
So truthfully, we're really involved in what we're doing. So there's a lot of work, a lot of meetings. We're trying to run here. We're trying to talk to different people in the army and whatnot to protect people. So we were really busy. So we weren't really following the world news and seeing what's happening. And we thought what happens outside doesn't affect us. And I think that was the general attitude, that we're in this own zone. So it was really shocking when we realized that this big world news of what's happening in the world and the changes that are happening in the US is affecting us this directly. And I think it's affecting us more than anybody in the whole world. We are going to lose people. People are going to die because of this. For us, it's life or death. We feel like we're caught in somebody else's politics, and we had to pay the biggest price.
I've got one more question, and I want to apologize in advance because this might sound a bit insensitive given the situation you're in right now with this war raging around you. But if you could speak to someone who, let's say, voted for Donald Trump, someone who might say, I feel bad for you, but Sudan feels pretty far away. Why should American taxpayers be responsible for sending aid money to distant parts of the world? What would you tell them?
World stability matters. And when you talk about the US is using less than 1% of their funding to make sure that the other countries are stable economically, they're stable politically, socially, then that will affect them, because in the end, we all live in one world. And I think all the countries in the world should be putting a small percentage of their money going towards this. The US is the biggest economy in the world, so in the end, yes, it will be the biggest amount of money, but I feel like this is something that should be taught to the rest of the world, not get rid of it. And I don't think this matters if you're progressive or if you're conservative or whatever you are, because I think these ideas are humanitarian, universal ideas.
As I was about to release this episode, the BBC reported that the Sudanese army had recaptured the presidential palace in the capital city of Khartoum after almost 2 years of fighting. While it's being recognized as a significant victory, large parts of Sudan remain under rebel control, and the end of the war is still a long way off. From Sudan, we're going to travel now 3,000 miles south to hear another perspective.
My name is Clarice Maduku. I'm the team leader for the Platform for Youth and Community Development, which is in the southeastern part of Zimbabwe. The organization is involved in community empowerment, where we focus specifically on defending girls and young women to fight gender-based violence. We also offer them psychosocial support due to the challenges that these communities are getting. Then the second project deals with climate resilience, where we deal with displacements and dispossessions of villagers. So this kind of work that we do, communities have become so much dependent The work that we do is kind of a lifeblood for them. As a community leader and a Zimbabwean citizen who is fairly active, I've been following closely the elections that were taking place in America, even on the day that Donald Trump was inaugurated. That was the first time that I noted that Donald Trump was keen on implementing the America First election manifesto that he has been speaking about during his campaign. Over the last 6 decades, Zimbabwe and Africa has been dependent on funding from America. So the impact of the 90-day pause, the stop work order, has been very huge. Some of the work that we're doing involved monitoring the activities of local governments in terms of increasing accountability and transparency. It also involved raising awareness and educating citizens in terms of their rights, where we're combating harmful cultural practices and ensuring that communities enjoy their rights. We realize that there are many people who take advantage of those who are not fully aware of their rights, or those who can't actively defend their rights. So the fact that we had been asked to stop immediately means our role is now missing, and the citizens remain vulnerable because the citizens that we work with are fragile. What this 90-day pause mean to our work is that we are now operating at 20% of our capacities. It makes the environment currently uncertain and unpredictable. And if things continue like this, it may give advantage to the perpetrators, those who have been perpetrating gender-based violence, or those who are using their positions of authority because they are either a government official or they have access to money, they are capitalists running some business locally, to abuse. So within 90 days, there is a lot that can happen, which can reverse the work that we have been doing for decades. To the Americans who voted for Donald Trump, I would encourage them to continue monitoring President Trump to meet what he has been promising during his campaign. And one of the things that he promised during his campaign was to say that America is first. But America is part of the global world, so America cannot have interests that are pure American. Most of the things that America has historically also depends on its foreign policy. There are so many issues or things that we relate with America. Zimbabwe has got resources, Africa has got resources that America also uses as raw materials. So within that relationship, the trading and the foreign aid is part of that process, which Americans need too.
More after this.
Europe is a complicated place. A lot of politics, a lot of languages, and a lot of different cultures crammed onto one continent.
The Europeans is an award-winning weekly podcast that makes sense of European news while managing to have fun at the same time. We bring you deep dives into European stories you might not have heard about.
Real assets are things that have physical substance.
Real assets.
Real assets. Sounds kind of funny.
Wait, Dominic, you suggesting it sounds kind of sexy?
Yeah, because people talk about your assets. Was that not the direction I was meant to go in?
I didn't see that coming at all.
Plus, in-depth interviews with fascinating Europeans.
What does it mean to be black in Europe? Can you build a community around that?
The Europeans. New episodes every Thursday. Find us wherever you're listening to this.
Africa's not the only continent reeling from this sudden loss of sorely needed financial assistance. People in the nation of Georgia are in a desperate battle to preserve their democracy amid rising authoritarianism and Russian influence. And American support through USAID has provided a crucial lifeline. But now that appears to have ended.
I think I would prefer to be anonymous because of our country context, which is not really very good right now. You probably know the context, or if you don't know, I can tell you a little bit that there was a sharp turn towards pro-Kremlin and pro-Russian positions. They actually declared very recently that European integration is not any longer the goal of the country. And basically, this was happening throughout the last, 1.5, 2 years maybe. And then the adoption of the Russian law in April 2024 was the first dangerous signal that they have given to us. And ever since those times, our USAID program and the US Embassy's relationship with the government of Georgia was pretty complicated.
Georgia's so-called Russia law is based upon a similar statute in Moscow, and it mandates that media outlets, NGOs, and other nonprofits register with the government and be labeled as pursuing the interests of a foreign power if they receive more than 20% of their funding from abroad. Critics view it as a threat to press freedom and democracy itself.
I've been working in the development field for 20 years now. I've been always striving and trying to support marginalized groups, vulnerable communities. So basically, I identify myself being a human rights defender. And yeah, it's not safe right now to be identified because within the current law and local legislation, it identifies us as persons who are acting not for the favor of their country's interest. Unfortunately, yeah, we are labeled as foreign agents. And so maybe a year ago, I would say I don't have a problem to be identified. But unfortunately, now I have to say that I prefer to be anonymous. I've been working for one of the biggest programs that USAID used to fund. So basically, our work was centered around the issues of minorities integration, equality standards. The goal of the program broadly was support of good governance in Georgia and decentralization reform. We believe that improved local governance contributes to improved living standards and improved economic development and basically European-like standards of governance. And there were many other programs like Unity Through Diversity that was supporting minority organizations to be resilient, to raise their voices, to be independent. So lots of programs. What happened now is that because of the decision of the US government, the program is suspended. We are still going through the shock. We still need some time to digest what has happened to us. And there are still some beliefs that in 3 months, things will be settled down and the ongoing programs will have a chance to continue, which I personally do not believe, honestly, because more I read, more I believe that this is not going to resolve anytime soon, unless some miracle happens. We became very obviously under the interests and influence of Russia. Our country is governed by the pro-Russian oligarch right now, and protests are taking place every day in the streets of the capital since the latest parliamentary elections, which were not considered to be legitimate, and this government is not recognized as legitimate currently by international society and organizations. These protests last for 2.5 months, and we were kind of cheering up and saying, few more months, perhaps spring will bring some changes. So basically, we hope that we would shake up the system, the government, but we are now in quite vulnerable situation without the big supporter as the USAID. Where can we get these resources to make sure that we can resist and continue this fight with disinformation and Russian propaganda, which is a huge problem in this country? I'm not sure how can we survive. On daily basis, we are observing how public servants are fired and kicked out from their jobs because of their pro-European position, because of the fact that they openly protest against Russian integration. And when a person actually raises his or her voice, he's getting direct streets from the government if you are working in a government structure, right? And basically the safest place was the civil society sector. Like, we had the big hopes that this civil society sector and international organizations and donors would secure some kind of spaces for people who are fighting against Russian influence. But unfortunately, it was the decision of the US government to suspend all the current programs and stop support. It puts us in a very vulnerable condition. We don't know what to do. We know that there is a real risk that we won't have enough resources to keep this fight somehow going on, because we won't be secured financially, with no salary, with no minimal income. A person who is working during the daytime and protesting during the evening hours becomes even more vulnerable, because you have to think about your financial security.
There might be some people listening to our conversation right now who would honestly have trouble finding the country of Georgia on a map. And they might be thinking, this is somewhere really far away from the United States. I don't see how this is relevant to me or why my American tax dollars should be going to fund these programs. Make your best argument for why they should care.
Because it's a post-Soviet country, which was the first to declare independence. We want to be a part of the Western world. And I think US is the best and will be always the best example for anyone in the world as a model for striving to become democratic and independent. And without US support, we will be left in the past and in the hands of the Russian Empire, which has done nothing but just tragedy to this country and many other countries throughout the region. US was the biggest supporter in this process for Georgian people to become democratic state with strong institutions. And I think people of Georgia need and require this assistance.
Finally, this view from a country with one of the highest rates of HIV infection in the world.
Hi, Scott.
Oh, hi there. Thanks so much for taking the time to speak to me. I appreciate it.
I hope I can help you out. I'm not convinced, but we'll give it a shot.
Can you start off by introducing yourself and telling me where I'm reaching you today?
I am Dr. James Lees. I am an American citizen who moved to South Africa in 2001 after working in the US and India since about 1987 with HIV and AIDS prevention and treatment. Came here in 2001 to do the same thing. Stayed, have been here for all these years, living outside of Cape Town.
And just to remind listeners, how big of an issue is AIDS and HIV prevention in South Africa?
Look, right at the moment, there's a place called Bloemfontein that has the highest rate of HIV infection in the world, according to recent research. There are pockets of HIV infection where 30-year-old women have as high as a 70% rate of HIV amongst them, and men 40%. These are pockets, they are hotspots. It's a particular dynamic that created them. And USAID has been very on top of these hotspots for a long time, working to address them quickly, because it's from the hotspots that infection can spread elsewhere.
Do you remember what your first reaction was when you heard that this funding could be cut?
Well, at that very moment, I learned that a piece of work that I was scheduled to complete and do the last part of it in Nigeria was then canceled because it was defunded. And it was an incredibly innovative piece of work with young Nigerian people across the country for HIV prevention and the reduction of sexual violence. A tremendous amount of work has gone into that program. It's all developed, ready to roll. People just needed to be trained, and now it has been stopped. And so I think the emoji that I used most in the last sort of week on my WhatsApp account is the broken heart.
And what sorts of conversations have you had with friends and colleagues over the past few days?
It's interesting because I told a couple of friends and colleagues of mine that you were going to phone this evening. And actually, I wanted to say, hey, if you would like to speak to someone else. The response was, they're too afraid. They're too afraid for their possible positions, too afraid for any repercussions if they speak up. They're afraid that they will get targeted, and therefore, if the programs do start again, they won't be funded. Their NGO won't be funded. They will find themselves out of a job, even though so many of them right at the moment are now finding themselves out of a job. And remember, these NGOs are on the front line and hire local people in communities. And for community prevention work, people are getting paid, let me just calculate it in American dollars, maybe $250 a month. And people are working full time, putting their heart and soul into really wonderful HIV prevention response for $250 a month. So to shut that down is heartbreaking. As an anthropologist, I want to just take a little bit of a historical perspective for a moment, if I could, with you. I've, of course, been up on a lot that's written in the press right at the moment about, what's happening in Africa, what this means for Africans. Another concern is, what does it mean for Americans as well? And I think it's an important point. When I moved here in 2001, I actually arrived 5 days before 9/11, immediately warned by the U.S. consulate not to go out, not to speak if I didn't have to because an American accent would be recognized, not to wear American clothing. America wasn't in the good graces of South African people. Remember that Dick Cheney had lobbied to keep Nelson Mandela labeled as a terrorist and in prison. The United States had been a long ally of a very violent racist state. So we weren't exactly welcome individuals in South Africa. And it was my experience teaching then at a university where there was simply a tension because I was American. It got worse with 9/11, and then George Bush came along with his PEPFAR program. I think they did at some point along the way changed what some of the letters stood for, but essentially it's the President Emergency Fund for AIDS Relief. And I believe it was 2003 when he first announced it. It was for particular African countries. I believe that Haiti was involved in it. And so it was emergency relief to address the massive HIV pandemic that was affecting African countries. At the time, we were losing about 1,000 people a day to AIDS in South Africa, and we had about 1,300 new infections. We were losing ground tremendously at that time. So it was President Bush who stepped in with the PEPFAR program to address what really was an out-of-control pandemic. And for me, it was a brilliant piece of diplomacy because it started to soften a very tense relationship between South African people and American people. You don't find hostility towards Americans anymore in South Africa. In fact, you find quite the opposite, quite an openness, quite a very welcoming, quite friendly. And South African people recognize how much the American government, USAID, and PEPFAR have done to really address the situation of HIV in South Africa, stepping in at a time when the stigma was incredibly high. There was a woman activist in KwaZulu-Natal who spoke out about having HIV, and her neighbors actually killed her for bringing shame to their village. So the USAID work and the American government work in really investing in changing that attitude of stigma was a big piece of work that doesn't actually get as much attention as the medications, yet was absolutely essential and a big game changer in this country today. So there is, I would say, almost no stigma towards people with HIV these days. They get on treatment very quickly. That reduces the chance of transmission because it reduces viral load. And the system that USAID and PEPFAR helped to build is a really good system now.
So in real concrete terms, over the past few decades, what has that funding from PEPFAR and from USAID gone towards?
Research, treatment, building treatment systems, providing expertise, training doctors, providing medications, then the whole prevention arm, supporting NGOs across South Africa to do the prevention work in the communities themselves. I think some really sound and deeply important work has happened in South Africa because of PEPFAR and USAID.
You said earlier that the creation of PEPFAR really kind of brought about a change in how South Africans thought about the United States. Do you feel like all of this will also change how they feel about the U.S.?
I can tell you it already has. It already has. Not with hostility, but just with like gobsmacked, like, what are these people doing? At the moment, South Africans do have a really great relationship with America, and I can attest to that. I do not know the future of that.
Given how high the HIV rate is in South Africa, what do you expect will be the short and long-term impacts of having this funding cut?
My first concern would be the provision of antiretroviral medications for the treatment of HIV. And what they do is they reduce the HIV viral load to zero, which means that somebody with HIV can no longer transmit the virus to anyone else. It's a very critical part of HIV prevention anywhere in the world. When people are not on ARVs, when people have been on their ARVs, but suddenly they're stopped because of funding, in about a month's time, from 1 to 2 months, the amount of HIV virus in their bodies jumps. And of course, then they're able to transmit HIV to somebody else again. So just because you stop the funding or stop taking your ARV medications, it doesn't mean you can expect everybody to stop being sexual, right? And so it puts us back in the place that we were in the 1990s and the 2000s until PEPFAR came along, with no treatment, no medication. And so therefore, what I fully expect is infection rates to go right back up again, unless governments can find other ways to provide antiretroviral medications for people with HIV.
So this bureaucratic decision in Washington could really lead to a lot more deaths, it sounds like.
No question about that. If you're on antiretroviral medications and then you just stop, it's not just that your HIV increases in your body and you have a higher chance of transmitting it to somebody else. Then the virus begins to attack your body once again, and you get sick and you die. So more transmissions, more deaths. From a pure economic point of view, it's a really incredibly short-sighted decision, because all this work and all this money has been invested in reducing the number of HIV infections and the medical demands in the country. It's a lot cheaper to give somebody ARV medications than it is to treat the illnesses. So the sheer cost of pulling these programs in dollars and cents is phenomenal. They have an extraordinary system built across the country of monitoring and response. And I actually think that that system will crash without American support, because it's not just the money, it's the expertise as well. It's the knowledge of how the system all works. Not that South Africans aren't competent and capable, but if you want to transition America out of their position and their leadership position in such kinds of systems that America has worked hard to develop, then you do it carefully, you do it thoughtfully, you do it respectfully. My biggest problem with this whole way that the new administration has acted, it's just such deep disregard for relationships, for other nations, and for the people of those nations. And I didn't think that that's who we are as human beings, to discount and disregard and dismiss so much of the world with a Sharpie, as it were, with a flick of a pen. I'm gobsmacked, I'm heartbroken, and I'm angry.
Early last month, Elon Musk held a news conference with President Trump in the White House to defend his work as head of the Department of Government Efficiency. He downplayed the criticism he had faced, pledged maximum transparency, and said that by electing Trump, Americans voted for major government reforms, so that's what he was going to give them. Among the many topics he discussed with reporters were his cuts to foreign assistance.
USAID has been one of your main targets. Are you concerned at all that some of the cuts or that shutting that agency altogether may lead to diseases or other bigger problems starting in other countries that then come to the United States?
Yeah, so that's an interesting example.
He said that the administration had made some mistakes in cutting Ebola and HIV prevention, but that the money would be quickly restored. This was on February 11th, however, and more than a month later, that still does not appear to have fully happened.
So,
do you see it as a worthy cause, USAID?
I think that there's some worthy things, but overall, if you say what was the bang for the buck, I would say it was not very good.
As Musk stood there in the Oval Office before the cameras and the microphones, he had his young son named X sitting on his shoulders. I couldn't help but wonder what someone in a place like his native country of South Africa would think, watching the richest man in the world talking casually about taking away this money that might literally determine whether they'll live or die. And also thinking about Musk's little 4-year-old boy who was incredibly lucky to be born into this life of immense privilege, while young children in other parts of the world may end up dying from disease or starvation through absolutely no fault of their own, because of the decisions of this one man. Thanks to the many people who helped me track down guests for this episode, including Melanie Reimer, Serena Patel, Sam Olakoya, Sasha Kramer, Dashan Moodley, and Declan Walsh, as well as Pastor Frank Akuma in Nigeria and the anonymous aid workers in Jordan and Sri Lanka that I interviewed but wasn't able to include. As always, you could drop me a line at info@farfromhomepodcast.org with your thoughts, feedback, or questions, or follow Far From Home on Instagram or Blue Sky. Also, check out my website at farfromhomepodcast.org to delve into my archives from my past 4 seasons of this show. And if you enjoyed this episode, please help spread the word by leaving me a rating or a review wherever you listen, posting about it on social media, or telling a friend. Until next time, I'm Scott Gurian. Thanks for listening.